Again, my name is Michael Berkowitz. I'm the president of 100 Resilient Cities, and you saw the video going earlier. We're an organization, as you might have guessed from our name, working in 100 cities around the world. We do 4 things with those cities: help them hire chief resilience officers like Toby. We help them create resilience strategies. Once they identify what they want to do, we crowd in partners and resources in the form of a platform of best-in-class technical experts, funding, technology, so that they can execute on their strategies, and we put them together in a peer-to-peer network. But that really is all I'm going to say about the organization itself. Really what I want to talk to you a little bit about is what this concept of urban resilience is, and give you some concrete examples of how cities are innovating to make themselves more resilient and what those challenges are. So I'm going to spend the next 15 or 20 minutes talking about that. And the idea of urban resilience is important, I think, to me and to cities, because cities have a very poor track record of predicting what next they're going to face. So if they knew what they were going to face, it would be a very simple risk management exercise. But cities don't get it right often, and that's because the world is complex and the world is changing. And I'll give you an example of one of our cities in Paris, France. Paris applied to our program in 2014 on the back of an environmental agenda. They wanted to talk about urban heat island and river flooding and air pollution. And you can see Paris has lots of air pollution, so that's a real thing. But then 2015 happened, and you had 2 terrorist attacks and a refugee crisis. And all of a sudden there was a need to have a conversation about what it meant to be Parisian, to be French, to be European, and what the integration of those people into French society, into Paris, how that was playing out. And so, to come back to urban resilience, this is chapter and verse, but very simply, urban resilience is about a city's ability to survive disaster. But don't just think about it as the sudden disasters: the earthquake, the hurricane, the typhoons, the coastal lows, the bushfires, terrorist attacks. Think about it also as the long-term, slow burn disasters, things we call chronic stresses. Think long-term food, water, and energy shortage. Think high levels of crime and violence. We have several cities in our network that either have been dealing with or are currently dealing with decades-long murder epidemics and crime waves. Think about it as shifting macroeconomic trends that disadvantage cities. So Detroit, Michigan in the United States, overexposed to a single industry, the American automobile industry. That industry became less and less competitive, and it had existential impacts for the city of Detroit. They actually started demapping some of the center city so they didn't have to provide utilities and public safety coverage and so on. And really what we think about when we think about urban resilience are cities' abilities to contextualize and deal with both of these threats at the same time. And let's think about what it is that makes a city able to deal with that wide range of threats, both the acute shocks and the chronic stresses. Of course, it's good emergency management and public health. That's essential. But it's community cohesion, where you have strong institutions that people trust, where neighbors check on neighbors. It's the fair and equitable provision of law, order, and justice, and a good law and criminal environment. It's solid protection of infrastructure, both the built environment as well as the natural environment. And it's an integrated planning structure with strong stakeholders at the table and a long-term vision. All of those things help cities survive and thrive in the face of shocks and stresses. And so that's really what urban resilience is about. It's about this holistic view. And how do cities do that? And it can be boiled down in some ways into 4 key qualities. First of all, they're inclusive, that they routinely and as a part of business include as many pieces of the city ecosystem as they can. Not just municipal government that I'm talking about here, but rather different parts of the community, of the private sector at different levels of government. This inclusiveness to make sure that all voices are heard is absolutely an essential characteristic of a resilient city. Second is that they're integrated. Too often in big organizations, private sector and public sector, the same kinds of people talk in their silos, but they don't coordinate across the silos. So transportation people think about transportation issues and talk to transportation people. Economic development people talk to economic development people. Housing people talk to housing people, and so on. And you miss either risks on the bad side or opportunities on the good side when you lack that integration. Third is that cities are both risk aware, and that's a bit of a technical exercise, understanding if we're planning to 2 degrees or we're planning for seismic safety or we're planning for a low level of bushfire risk, that we do that, but that they're also forward looking. That you understand that given the dynamic nature of cities, given climate change and all those other factors, that the past is not going to be a perfect predictor of the future. And that what you're thinking about and what you're planning for in the past and what you understand from the past will not suffice to understand what the future is. And for me, that's a very personal thing. I was the Deputy Commissioner of Emergency Management in New York City in the mid-90s and early 2000s, from 97 to 2005. And in the mid-90s, we were very, very worried about hurricanes. Hurricanes are a tremendous risk, and I'll talk a little bit about that to New York City. And we spent the 90s worrying about coastal storms and hurricanes. And then, of course, 2 planes flew into 2 buildings. And then you had anthrax attacks, and then you had the crash of American Air 587 in Queens, and then you had the Great Northeast Blackout, and then you had the 14th Street steam and explosion and blackout. And then you had the financial crisis of 2008, and only after that did you have Hurricane Sandy. And so that gives you a sense that cities don't understand exactly what they're going to face, and really why this concept of urban resilience is so important. And so after Sandy, of course, New York City got religion around preparing for the consequences of coastal storms and hurricanes, and in fact, sea level rise. And New York, as I said, is tremendously vulnerable to coastal storms. You forget how coastal a city is. It's got almost 800 miles of coastline. And it sits at the right angle between New Jersey and the coastline and Long Island, if you can picture where that is in the United States map. And that causes this tremendous piling of water into the New York harbor and exposing this area, some of the world's, if not the world's, most valuable real estate, to the effects of climate change and storm surge and hurricanes. And so New York has spent some time in a partnership with the Rockefeller Foundation and the federal government, namely the Department of Housing and Urban Development. New York spent some time thinking about how to address this challenge and designing for it. And I'm going to tell you that story because I think it illustrates what the opportunities are to think about our interventions and our challenges in new and innovative ways. Now, climate change and storm surge are not the only things that are facing New York, as I don't need to remind you, but just to give you a smattering of some of the other things that are going on, we've got community cohesion issues and, the whole Black Lives Matter and a lack of trust of people in certain communities in the police and other institutions. We have public health and an obesity epidemic. We have affordable housing. We have biodiversity. We have the urban heat island effect. We have lots and lots of challenges that are threatening and weakening New York and eroding our ability to recover, respond to both the shocks and the stresses. And so I give you a little bit of let me back up. So this is a piece of road, it's 2, that's on the east side. If you go up and see the bridge on the right-hand side, this is a piece of roadway that I'm going to show you that sort of illustrates all of these things. This is post-Sandy. This is the FDR Drive, for those of you who are familiar with it. You can see there's flooding, but I'll point out a couple of other features here. You have public housing, that brick housing on the left-hand side, and you see this massive road that's actually cutting off the people who live in that public housing, that social housing, to the access to the park. It's actually, even though they're within a stone's throw of seeing that park, it's very hard to get there. They have to walk up a very narrow, if they're going to walk it, and there are other ways to get there, but if they're going to walk it, they have to walk up a very narrow flight of stairs over a kind of scary pedestrian bridge and down the other side. What New York City and the feds and Rockefeller did was think about ways in which we could address all of these shocks and stresses together. And what we did is we ran something called Rebuild by Design. It's an inclusive, community-driven, design-led process over about a year or 15 months that brought in some of the world's top designers, but also engaged the community in an ongoing way to understand what were some challenges and what were some solutions that could address this. And you see there are many, many shots here, but this is one engaging young children in imagining what their future would look like. And what we came up with, what the designers came up with and the citizens came up with, was something called the Big U. Big is actually a reference to Bjarke Ingels' group, the Danish architect who sort of led this process. And it's a series of green infrastructure that will ring Lower Manhattan and protect it from 2 degrees temperature and the associated sea level rise and the storms that are on top of that. And I want to point out that this is relatively new stuff in the thinking of cities. Cities would normally approach this problem as an engineering one. How high do we have to make the wall in order to protect all that valuable real estate on the other side of it? And let's talk about that. And what this represents is the beginning of a shift in thinking. You can see as you go up the public housing, the public housing up on the other side of the highway. And you can see that what happens, what the designers have envisioned is the land would be raised and elevated so that actually it gets to the top of the highway. And what that allows the city to do is to lay pedestrian bridges basically at grade. Nice, wide, generous pedestrian bridges over that highway connecting the public housing to the park in a new and much more accessible way. So that's one thing. Second is that it starts to solve for some of the biodiversity and some of the rainfall flooding that plagues this area. So you plant it in different ways with different species. You create a much more accessible and attractive park for people to exercise in. And now that you have large pedestrian entrances to that park, people can actually access it in a real way and start to really use it. And so if you build it in this way, what you do is you start to address obesity and public health issues and biodiversity, and you plant trees and you start to deal with some of the urban heat island impacts from climate change, and you protect yourself from storm surge and sea level. The other thing that often happens when you start to build infrastructure, green or otherwise, but particularly gray infrastructure, is that it becomes a barrier, and it becomes places where that separate people. One of the interesting features here is that the designers imagined public art on the you can see it up on the ceiling there of the walkway to make it an attractive space for people to congregate and for artists and others to display their work. But what that is a flip down storm barriers, so that at times you may actually need to keep the water out in very serious ways, and this is what would happen. It's a great example of art protecting us from ourselves or something. Now, what's interesting is that when you engage the community in this different way, sometimes you get to solutions that, if you were just looking at it from a technical perspective, don't necessarily are suboptimal. But because you've engaged the community, actually the process is probably more valuable than the ultimate solution you got to. And so this is a drawing of that same stretch. It envisions burying the road, and that was eliminated because I think it was too expensive. So there are things that wouldn't happen. But I also want to use this slide to talk about another solution that was discarded. And that is that you see those buildings. Each of those buildings has apartments all the way from the top floor to the ground floor. And there's no communal space. And what the designers envisioned was you could build those buildings, you could retrofit those buildings so that they could have wet feet. They could sustain flooding at the ground floor. And what you could do is move people out of those ground floor apartments and put community centers there. So you would generate community cohesion, you would reduce the risk to those facilities, and what you would do is build another tower to house all of the ground floor residents of these public housing. And the community didn't trust the government to follow through on that process. Once they thought they were out of their ground floor apartments, they didn't think they'd ever get back in. And so they nixed that, even though for me, that's an amazing design solution and makes a lot of sense. Ultimately, the community didn't trust it, and it did come out of the design. And I think regardless of what the next thing that happens in New York, and it's happening now, right? There are demonstrations on the street based on the US election, that kind of engagement with the community, even if it doesn't lead to the optimal technical solution, will still pay resilience dividends. So let's come back to Paris. Paris, which you can see here, is a low-density city in the proper city, and that's forced all of the new development and the new migrants to actually live on the periphery. And Paris is walled off, basically, and you can see it there by what's called the Boulevard Périphérique, the ring road that goes around. And when you hit that line, you're in a different kind of place. I was there for COP21 last year. I cycled from COP to Le Bourget, which is out in these suburbs, every day to the conference. And in the beginning, you are in Parisian bliss. It looks like you should have a baguette and a nice bottle of wine, and you're on your bicycle, and it's beautiful. You're waving at people. You hit the Boulevard Périphérique, and you're in another world. You're on a highway. People are zooming by. There are ugly high-rises and so on. And so it's possible that some of Paris's cohesion issues have been caused by the fact that they've been so low density in the city, and all of their new immigrants have been in these high rises and suburban communities on the periphery. And so the challenge in Paris, and we're just beginning to get there now, is to think how, with every euro Paris spends on climate adaptation and mitigation, everything they spend to meet their commitments to COP21, how can that have a cohesive effect? They're going to do rezoning, they'll put in electric cars, they'll do bike share, they'll do bike share expansion, they'll do new bike lanes, they might do parks and so on and so forth. How does each one of those, from design to funding to building to maintenance, how throughout that continuum can you look at that with a second lens that says, how does this promote the cohesion and break down the barriers between Paris and its suburbs, ultimately making Paris stronger, more livable, more resilient to the next thing that happens, which won't be terrorism or flooding, it will be something else. And so I guess I would leave it there to say that, you know, I come and I look around in Melbourne, and you guys have an amazing city. You know that. One of the most livable cities, the most livable city, 6 years in a row, depending on how that is. But I also know that you're facing growth and changes. You may double the city over this course of this next generation. That will come with accompanying infrastructure and so on. And so I think the challenge for you all is to understand how, throughout all that change, all that building, can you continue to do it in inclusive, integrated, forward-looking, and risk-aware ways. Because if you do that, then you will double the value of your investment, and you will continue to keep this an amazing place. If you don't, the chances that infrastructure building and new populations and changing demographics will begin to hurt the resilience of this amazing city are out there. And so I think that's the challenge going forward, and I would thank you very much.